I'm Anna Sanders, 34, and I was 3 days away from closing the biggest government contract in my company's history. $67 million that would secure our future for the next decade. Then my CEO called me into his office with a termination letter, citing budget cuts to save $1,200 a month on my salary. He had no idea I was the only one who knew the real reason that deal was about to go through. What happened next would cost him everything, and finally show him the true value of loyalty. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever been underestimated or cast aside by someone who should have protected you, this story is for you. Like this video to hear how sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing the scales. Let me take you back to the beginning, to understand how a simple termination letter became the catalyst for one man's complete downfall. I'd been Senior Government Relations Manager at TechFlow Solutions for 5 years of building relationships, understanding the intricate dance of federal procurement, and delivering results that kept our small cybersecurity firm afloat. While my colleagues focused on flashy presentations and networking events, I spent my time in the trenches, learning the actual technical requirements that government contracts demanded. My background wasn't typical for someone in my position. I'd grown up in a military family. My father was a career Air Force officer. My brother served in the Army's cybersecurity division. I understood the government mindset, the emphasis on reliability, thoroughness, and actual capability over marketing. This wasn't just a job for me. It was a calling rooted in genuine respect for public service. TechFlow Solutions had been struggling financially for the past 2 years. We weren't the biggest player in cybersecurity, nor the most well-funded. What we had was expertise, particularly in the specialized field of military network security. But expertise doesn't pay the bills if you can't translate it into contracts. And that's where I came in. My track record spoke for itself. In 5 years, I'd brought in over $200 million in government contracts. Not the small stuff either. Major Department of Defense initiatives, Department of Homeland Security projects, critical infrastructure protection deals. Each one required months of relationship building, technical research, and navigating the labyrinthine world of federal procurement regulations. But here's the thing about government contracts that most people don't understand. They're not just about having the best technology or the lowest price. They're about trust, reliability, and long-term relationships. Government officials need to know they can count on you not just to deliver what you promise, but to be there for the long haul when issues arise. That's where CEO Marcus Webb and I fundamentally differed. Marcus was a typical startup founder, charismatic and ambitious, but he treated government contracts like any other business deal. He'd swoop in for final presentations, charm the room, then disappear back to his corner office while I handled the real work of implementation and relationship maintenance. Marcus had founded TechFlow 8 years ago with venture capital funding and grand visions of disrupting the cybersecurity industry. The problem was, his business model relied on rapid growth and flashy innovations, while government work required patience, consistency, and deep technical expertise. As the startup funding dried up and pressure mounted from investors, Marcus became increasingly desperate to cut costs wherever he could. That's the irony that would ultimately destroy him. In his desperation to save money, he was about to eliminate the very person who brought money into the company. I was earning $120,000 annually, which he saw as an expensive line item. What he failed to understand was that my salary represented less than 0.1% of the revenue I generated. The company culture reflected Marcus's priorities. The sales team got bonuses, recognition, and premium office space. The technical staff and I were treated as necessary overhead, important for doing the work, but not valuable enough for real investment or recognition. I'd been passed over for promotions twice, despite consistently exceeding my targets, but I stayed loyal. I believed in our mission, in the technology we were developing, and in the importance of protecting national security infrastructure. I also genuinely cared about my colleagues, many of whom were brilliant engineers and analysts who deserved better than the instability Marcus's poor decisions created. Looking back, I can see how my loyalty blinded me to the reality of my situation. I kept thinking that if I just worked harder, brought in bigger contracts, proved my value more clearly, Marcus would eventually recognize my contributions. I was operating under the assumption that competence and results mattered more than office. Politics and personal relationships, that assumption was about to cost me everything and, ironically, cost Marcus far more than he could have imagined. The Department of Defense RFP that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. RFP. Request for proposal, the government's formal way of saying we need something, and we're willing to pay handsomely for it. This particular RFP was different from anything I'd seen in my career. The Pentagon needed a comprehensive cybersecurity overhaul for their entire Eastern Command network infrastructure. We're talking about protecting the digital backbone that connects military bases from Maine to Florida, safeguarding communications for over 200,000 personnel, and ensuring that critical national security information remained secure against increasingly sophisticated cyber threats. The contract value, $67 million over 3 years, with potential extensions that could double that amount. For a company like TechFlow, this wasn't just a big contract, it was the contract that would transform us from a struggling startup into a major player in the defense, cybersecurity space. But here's what made this opportunity both incredibly valuable and nearly impossible to win. The technical requirements were extraordinarily complex. The Pentagon wasn't just looking for standard cybersecurity solutions. They needed custom-built systems that could integrate with legacy military networks while providing next-generation threat detection and response capabilities. Most cybersecurity firms would look at the 847-page RFP document and either walk away or submit a generic proposal hoping to win on price. I spent 3 weeks studying every page, cross-referencing technical specifications with existing military standards, and mapping out exactly what the Pentagon actually needed versus what they thought they were asking for. That's when I discovered the compliance loophole that would make all the difference. Buried in Section 12.7. 3 of the technical requirements was a seemingly minor specification about data encryption standards for classified communications. Most bidders would simply note that they were compliant with current DoD standards and move on, but I knew something they didn't. My brother had mentioned during a family dinner 6 months earlier that the Army was quietly updating their encryption protocols to prepare for quantum computing threats. The change wasn't publicly announced yet, but it was coming, and any system that didn't account for it would be obsolete within 2 years. Spent 2 weeks researching quantum-resistant encryption methods, consulting with our technical team, and developing a solution that would not only meet current requirements, but remain viable for the next decade. It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach that government procurement officers dream about but rarely see. Then came the relationship-building phase. This is where my military family background became invaluable. I wasn't just some contractor trying to sell something to the government. I understood the culture, the priorities, and the people making these decisions. My primary contact was Colonel Sarah Martinez, the Pentagon's Director of Network Security Operations. Colonel Martinez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and understood better than anyone how critical reliable communications were to military operations. During our initial meetings, we didn't just discuss technical specifications, we talked about real-world applications, battlefield scenarios, and the life-or-death importance of systems that work when everything else fails. Over the course of 4 months, I built relationships with 12 key decision-makers across 3 different Pentagon departments. I attended industry briefings, participated in technical workshops, and gradually became known as the person who actually understood both the technical and operational sides of military cybersecurity. The breakthrough came during a security conference in Arlington. Colonel Martinez pulled me aside after my presentation on quantum-resistant encryption and said something that gave me chills. "Anna, you're the first contractor I've met who actually gets what we're trying to accomplish here. Most people just want to sell us their existing products. You're thinking about what we'll need 5 years from now." That's when I knew we had a real chance. Not just to submit a competitive bid, but to win the contract outright. By August, I had preliminary approval from the Pentagon's Technical Review Board. By September, we'd passed the initial security clearance requirements. By October, Colonel Martinez was telling me that our proposal was exactly what we've been looking for. Marcus knew none of this. He'd check in occasionally, asking how the big government thing was going, but he never bothered to understand the details. In his mind, government contracts were just larger versions of corporate sales. You submit a proposal, maybe give a presentation, and either you win or you don't. He had no idea that I'd spent 7 months building relationships, understanding requirements, and positioning TechFlow as the only contractor who truly understood what the Pentagon needed. He didn't know about the late-night phone calls with technical advisors, the weekend trips to military conferences, or the countless hours I'd spent ensuring every detail of our proposal was perfect. Marcus did know was that this contract would solve all of TechFlow's financial problems. $67 million would pay off our debts, fund expansion, and provide the stability he needed to satisfy investors. He'd started telling people the deal was in the bag, taking credit for strategic decisions he'd never made. In early November, Colonel Martinez called to let me know that final approval was expected within the week. "Anna," she said, "I want you to know that your work on this proposal has been exceptional. The Technical Review Board specifically requested that you be the primary point of contact for implementation. They trust you, and frankly, so do I." 3 days before that final approval was supposed to come through, Marcus called me into his office with a termination letter. He was about to throw away 7 months of careful relationship building, technical expertise, and Pentagon trust to save $1,200 a month on my salary. He had no idea what he was about to lose. To understand Marcus Webb's catastrophic decision, you need to understand the pressure he was under, and the financial reality he was desperately trying to hide from everyone, including me. TechFlow's single quotes S financial statements told a story of a company teetering on the edge of collapse. What started as a promising cybersecurity startup with $15 million in venture funding had devolved into a cash-burning machine that was hemorrhaging money faster than it could bring in revenue. The company's monthly operating expenses were running at $890,000, while monthly revenue averaged only $720,000. We were losing $170,000 every month, and our cash reserves were down to less than 6 months of operating capital. Marcus had been juggling creditors, delaying vendor payments, and taking increasingly desperate measures to keep the lights on. The irony was painful. While I was on the verge of bringing in a $67 million contract that would solve all our financial problems, Marcus was panicking about covering payroll for the next quarter. He'd been having heated phone calls with investors, tense meetings with the bank, and sleepless nights trying to figure out how to buy more time. But instead of communicating these challenges to his senior staff, Marcus chose to handle everything alone. His leadership style had always been secretive and controlling, but the financial pressure had made it worse. He'd shut down department meetings, stopped sharing quarterly reports, and began making unilateral decisions without consulting anyone. Started noticing the signs months earlier. Vendors were calling our office directly asking about overdue payments. The cleaning service had been reduced from daily to twice weekly. The coffee in the break room had been switched to a cheaper brand. Small things, but they painted a picture of a company cutting corners wherever possible. Marcus's approach to cost-cutting was scattershot and counterproductive. He'd eliminate $500 monthly expenses while approving $50,000 marketing campaigns that produced no measurable results. He'd fire administrative staff who kept operations running smoothly, then hire expensive consultants to fix the problems their absence created. The most frustrating part was watching him prioritize style over substance. Marcus had recently spent $75,000 renovating his corner office, new furniture, artwork, a coffee machine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Meanwhile, our technical team was working with outdated equipment, and I was being told that my request for a $2,000 software license was not in the budget. His management philosophy seemed to be that looking successful was more important than actually being successful. He drove a Tesla, wore expensive suits, and maintained the appearance of a thriving CEO, even as the company crumbled around him. Image mattered more than results, relationships more than competence. This mindset extended to how he viewed employees. Marcus divided the company into two categories: people who made him look good, and people who did the actual work. The sales team, marketing department, and business development staff were his favorites. They generated buzz, brought in meetings, and helped maintain the illusion of success. The technical staff and I fell into the second category. We were overhead, necessary evils that consumed resources without contributing to Marcus's personal brand. He didn't understand what we did, couldn't explain our value to investors, and therefore saw us as expendable when budget cuts became necessary. I'd been passed over for promotions twice in favor of less qualified candidates who had better relationships with Marcus. The first time, a marketing coordinator with no government experience was promoted to strategic partnerships director with a $20,000 salary increase. The second time, Marcus hired an outside consultant to fill a role I'd essentially already been doing for 2 years. Each time, I was told that I was more valuable in my current role and that my expertise was too important to risk moving to something new. Translation: I was too useful doing the actual work to be promoted to a position where I might have influence over strategic decisions, but I stayed loyal because I believed in the mission and cared about my colleagues. The engineering team was brilliant, dedicated professionals who genuinely wanted to protect critical infrastructure and serve national security interests. They deserved better than Marcus's chaotic leadership, but they needed the stability of steady employment while they worked on meaningful projects. Also genuinely believed that success would eventually force Marcus to recognize my contributions. The Pentagon contract was so significant, so obviously the result of my relationships and expertise, that surely it would demonstrate my value in terms even he couldn't ignore. What I didn't understand was that Marcus's decision-making had become purely reactive. He wasn't thinking strategically about long-term value or even basic cause and effect. He was simply looking at monthly expenses and cutting whatever seemed easiest to eliminate. From his perspective, my $10,000 monthly salary was a line item that could be removed to help balance the books. The fact that this salary was connected to relationships worth millions of dollars, or that eliminating me might jeopardize the very contract that could save his company, never entered his calculation. Marcus had also convinced himself that government contracts were essentially automatic once you reached a certain point in the process. In his mind, if the Pentagon was ready to award us the contract, then the hard work was already done. Anyone could handle the final paperwork and implementation. He had no idea that government relationships are personal, built on trust and maintained through consistent, competent interaction. He didn't understand that Colonel Martinez and her team weren't just buying a cybersecurity system, they were entering into a partnership with people they trusted to protect national security. That trust was about to be shattered, and Marcus was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his career. Tuesday, November 15th started like any other day. I arrived at the office early, as I always did, with my usual coffee and the organized determination that had driven my success in government relations. I had 3 important items on my agenda: a final review call with Colonel Martinez about contract specifications, preparation of implementation timelines, and coordination with our technical team for the upcoming Pentagon presentation. I was literally 3 days away from the biggest triumph of my career, and I felt that mixture of excitement and nervous energy that comes with approaching the finish line of a marathon. Everything was aligned perfectly. The Pentagon was ready to award the contract. Our technical solution was exactly what they needed, and months of relationship building were about to pay off in the most spectacular way possible. My morning started with emails from Pentagon colleagues expressing enthusiasm about moving forward. Colonel Martinez had sent a note saying the final approval meeting was scheduled for Friday, and that she looked forward to beginning implementation immediately. The Department of Defense Procurement Office had requested our banking information for contract setup. Everything pointed to success. At 10:30 a.m., Marcus's assistant Jennifer knocked on my office door with an unusual request. Marcus would like to see you in his office immediately. The tone was formal, which struck me as odd, but I assumed he wanted an update on the Pentagon contract, or perhaps finally wanted to discuss the recognition and promotion I'd been hoping for. I gathered my files, straightened my jacket, and walked down the hall to Marcus's corner office with genuine optimism. This was going to be the conversation where my value was finally acknowledged, where years of hard work and loyalty were rewarded, where the company's biggest success became the foundation for my advancement. Marcus was seated behind his oversized desk, not looking up as I entered. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his silver hair styled with the same precision he brought to his public appearances. But something was wrong. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by an uncomfortable tension that filled the room. "Please, sit down," he said, still not making eye contact. On his desk was a manila folder, positioned between us like a barrier. My heart began to race, though I couldn't yet understand why. "Anna, I'm going to be direct with you. TechFlow is facing some challenging financial realities, and we need to make some difficult decisions to ensure our long-term viability." His voice had the rehearsed quality of someone delivering a speech they'd practiced multiple times. I felt my stomach drop, but I tried to maintain professional composure. "Marcus, if this is about budget concerns, I should mention that the Pentagon contract will be officially awarded on Friday. $67 million will more than address any short-term financial challenges we're facing." He finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes that chilled me. Not gratitude or excitement about our impending success, but annoyance at being interrupted. "That's actually part of what I need to discuss with you. We've decided to restructure our government relations approach, and unfortunately, your position is being eliminated." The words hit me like a physical blow. I literally felt the air leave my lungs, and for a moment, I couldn't process what he was saying. "Eliminated? Marcus, I don't understand. The contract is 3 days away from final approval. I've spent 7 months building the relationships that made this possible. Anna, I appreciate your contributions, but we need to reduce our overhead expenses. Your salary represents $120,000 annually, plus benefits, plus the various travel and conference expenses associated with your role. We're looking at savings of approximately $1,200 per month by eliminating your position. $1,200. He was destroying my career, jeopardizing a $67 million contract, and potentially bankrupting his own company to save $1,200 per month. The absurdity was so complete that I almost laughed, except that the betrayal was too devastating. For humor, Marcus, you can't be serious. Do you understand what this contract means? Do you realize that the Pentagon officials expect me to be the primary implementation contact? This isn't just about my job, this is about relationships I've spent years building." He opened the manila folder and slid a document across the desk. "This is your termination letter, effective immediately. We'll provide 2 weeks of severance pay, and of course, we'll give you positive references for future employment opportunities." I stared at the letter without really reading it. My hands were shaking, and I felt a combination of rage and disbelief that made it difficult to speak clearly. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. This contract isn't guaranteed just because we submitted a proposal. It's based on trust, on relationships, on the Pentagon's confidence in specific people. If I'm not here to implement this project, there may not be a project to implement. Anna, I appreciate your concerns, but I think you're overestimating your importance in this process. Government contracts are awarded based on technical specifications and competitive pricing. The relationships are nice to have, but they're not essential to closing the deal. In that moment, I realized that Marcus fundamentally misunderstood. Everything about government procurement, everything about the work I'd been doing, and everything about the value I brought to the company. He saw me as an expensive administrative assistant, rather than the person who had single-handedly positioned TechFlow for its biggest success ever. But what hurt more than his ignorance was the casual cruelty of his dismissal. After 5 years of loyalty, of working weekends and missing family events to build this company's reputation, of generating over $200 million in revenue, he was discarding me like an unnecessary expense. "I need you to clean out your office and return any company property by the end of the day," he continued, as if discussing routine paperwork rather than destroying someone's career. "Jennifer will escort you to gather your personal belongings." As I stood to leave, still clutching the termination letter, Marcus added one final insult. "And Anna, I'll need you to provide a complete transition document for whoever takes over the Pentagon account. We want to ensure continuity for our client relationship. After 7 months of my work, my relationships, my expertise, he was already claiming ownership of what I'd built. He expected me to hand over years of relationship building and technical knowledge to help him profit from my efforts even after discarding me. I looked at him one last time, seeing him clearly for the first time since I'd joined the company. Marcus Webb wasn't a visionary leader or a strategic thinker. He was a man so focused on short-term survival that he was willing to destroy the very foundation of his long-term success. "I'll clean out my office," I said quietly. "But Marcus, I think you're about to learn something important about the value of the relationships you're throwing away." I walked out of his office knowing that I would never provide that transition document, and that Marcus Webb was about to discover just how much his decision to save $1,200 per month was going to cost him. Walking back to my office in a daze, I felt like I was moving through someone else's nightmare. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the familiar sounds of office life muffled and distant. My colleagues looked up as I passed, some offering cheerful greetings that I barely managed to acknowledge. They had no idea that their company had just committed corporate suicide. As I began packing my personal belongings, my hands trembling with a mixture of shock and rage, fragments of conversations from the past few weeks suddenly began to make sense. Marcus's confident statements to investors about securing major government contracts, his casual mentions of our Pentagon deal during board meetings, his recent hiring of a junior sales associate specifically to support our growing government relations division. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Marcus had decided that once the Pentagon contract was secured, he no longer needed the person who'd secured it. In his mind, I was expensive overhead that could be eliminated once the hard work was done. What he failed to understand was that the hard work was just beginning, but there was something else, something that made his betrayal even more calculated and cruel. 3 weeks earlier, I'd overheard a phone conversation between Marcus and our head of sales, David Chen. I'd been working late, as usual, when their voices carried from the conference room where they thought they were alone. "The Pentagon deal is basically done," Marcus had said. "Anna's done good work getting us to this point, but let's be honest, anyone can handle the implementation phase. We're paying her $120,000 to be a glorified project manager. Once the contract is signed, we can bring in someone at half the cost." David had expressed some concern about maintaining relationships with Pentagon officials, but Marcus had dismissed it. Government bureaucrats don't care about relationships once the paperwork is signed. They care about deliverables and timelines. We can handle that with anyone who's organized and follows instructions. At the time, I told myself I must have misunderstood. Surely Marcus wouldn't be planning to eliminate me just as we reached the biggest success of my career. Surely he understood that my relationships with Pentagon officials were personal, built on trust and expertise that couldn't be easily transferred to someone else. Now, I realized that conversation had been Marcus's real plan all along. He'd been waiting for the contract to be formally awarded before eliminating what he saw as unnecessary expense. The only thing that had changed was his timeline. Financial pressure had forced him to act 3 days earlier than he'd originally planned. But Marcus had made a critical error in his calculations. He assumed that government contracts, once awarded, were essentially guaranteed. He didn't understand that until the final signatures were in place and implementation began, the Pentagon retained the right to withdraw from negotiations for any reason. More importantly, he didn't understand that Colonel Martinez and her team weren't just buying a cybersecurity system. They were entering into a partnership with people they trusted. That trust was personal, built on months of interaction with me specifically, and it wasn't transferable to whoever Marcus decided to hire as my replacement. As I packed my desk, I pulled out a small encrypted USB drive that I'd kept locked in my drawer. This drive contained something Marcus didn't know existed: complete documentation of every conversation, every meeting, every technical specification, and every relationship detail related to the Pentagon contract. I wasn't paranoid by nature, but my military family background had taught me the importance of documentation and backup plans. Over the months of working on this contract, I'd carefully recorded not just the official requirements and proposals, but also the informal conversations, personal preferences, and unspoken concerns that really drove Pentagon decision-making. Drive contained email conversations with Colonel Martinez about her specific security concerns based on her deployment experiences, technical notes about modifications she'd requested based on real-world operational needs, documentation of the quantum-resistant encryption approach that had impressed the technical review board, contact information and relationship histories for 12 key Pentagon decision-makers. Most importantly, it contained evidence of something Marcus had no idea about: the Pentagon's growing concerns about TechFlow's financial stability. Colonel Martinez had asked me directly, 3 weeks ago, about our company's long-term viability. "Anna," she'd said, "we need to know that you'll be there for the full contract term. We've had too many contractors go out of business or get acquired in the middle of critical projects." I'd assured her that TechFlow was financially stable and that I would personally oversee the entire implementation. That assurance had been crucial to the Pentagon's decision to move forward with our proposal. Now Marcus was about to prove that both parts of my assurance were false. As I copied the last of my personal files and prepared to leave TechFlow forever, I realized that Marcus had handed me something he never intended to give: complete control over the future of his company. The encrypted drive in my pocket contained the keys to either TechFlow's greatest success or its total destruction. Marcus thought he was eliminating an expensive employee. What he'd actually done was create an enemy who knew exactly how much damage his decision was about to cause. The Pentagon contract wasn't just at risk, it was about to become the catalyst for everything Marcus had worked to build coming apart at the seams. Walked out of TechFlow's offices for the last time, carrying not just my personal belongings, but the power to determine whether Marcus Webb would emerge from this crisis as a successful CEO or as a cautionary tale about the cost of betraying the people who make your success possible. The choice was no longer his to make. It was mine. I sat in my car in the TechFlow parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at my phone and trying to process what had just happened. The professional part of my mind was already calculating next steps, updating my resume, reaching out to contacts, beginning the job search process. But the emotional part was still reeling from the betrayal and the casual cruelty of Marcus's dismissal. Finally, I forced myself to focus on the immediate crisis. The Pentagon was expecting final confirmation of our implementation timeline by Thursday. Colonel Martinez was planning to announce the contract award to her team on Friday. If I didn't warn them about what was happening at TechFlow, they were going to be blindsided by the chaos that Marcus's decision would inevitably create. My first call was to Colonel Martinez herself. Her assistant put me through immediately, which was typical of the relationship we built over the past 7 months. "Anna, perfect timing. I was just reviewing the final implementation schedules with my team. We're all excited to get started next week. Is everything on track from your end? The question hit me like a physical blow. Everything was not on track. Everything was about to fall apart in the most spectacular way possible. But I had to navigate this conversation carefully. I couldn't let my personal situation compromise the Pentagon's evaluation of TechFlow's proposal, even though Marcus had already done exactly that. Colonel Martinez, I need to inform you of some changes in our company structure that may affect the implementation timeline. As of this morning, I'm no longer with TechFlow Solutions. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted from friendly enthusiasm to sharp professional concern. Anna, what do you mean you're no longer with the company? Are you saying you've been promoted? Or are you telling me that TechFlow has eliminated the primary point of contact for a $67 million defense contract 3 days before final approval? I chose my words carefully. The company has decided to restructure their government relations department. I'm calling because I want to ensure proper transition and continuity for the Pentagon's needs. Anna, stop being diplomatic for a minute. What the hell is going on over there? You've been the face of this project for 7 months. You know our requirements better than anyone. You understand our operational needs. Are you telling me that TechFlow just fired the one person we trust to implement this contract? The concern in her voice was mixed with something else, anger. Colonel Martinez had invested significant time and credibility in recommending TechFlow's proposal to her superiors. She'd built her recommendation around the confidence she had in me personally. Marcus's decision didn't just affect TechFlow, it made her look foolish to her own chain of command. Colonel, I can't speak to the company's strategic decisions, but I want you to know that I'm committed to ensuring that your team has everything they need to move forward successfully. Anna, I appreciate your professionalism, but I need you to understand something. This contract isn't just about technology, it's about trust. We chose TechFlow specifically because we trusted you to deliver what you promised. If you're not there to oversee implementation, we need to seriously reconsider whether this partnership makes sense. My next call was to Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the Pentagon's Technical Review Coordinator. His reaction was even more direct. Anna, are you kidding me? Do you realize how much political capital I spent convincing the review board that TechFlow had the expertise to handle this project? That expertise was you. Without you there, I'm not sure they even understand what they've proposed. Sir, I've documented all the technical specifications and implementation requirements. The information can be transferred to whoever TechFlow assigns as my replacement. Anna, you know as well as I do that this isn't about documentation. It's about understanding the real-world operational needs behind those specifications. You spent time with our field teams. You understand why we need quantum-resistant encryption. You get the difference between what we wrote in the RFP and what we actually need in the field. Some new person reading your notes isn't going to have that contextual understanding. My third call was to Captain Maria Santos, the Pentagon's procurement oversight officer. Her response was the most ominous of all. Anna, I have to ask, are there financial stability issues at TechFlow that we should be aware of? Companies don't typically eliminate their primary client relationship manager right before closing their biggest contract unless they're facing serious problems. That question cut to the heart of the issue. The Pentagon's due diligence process included evaluating contractors' financial stability and long-term viability. Marcus's decision to fire me to save $1,200 per month was exactly the kind of short-sighted cost-cutting that suggested serious underlying financial problems. Captain Santos, I can't comment on internal company decisions, but I would encourage you to conduct whatever due diligence you feel is appropriate. At the end of the afternoon, I'd spoken with 8 Pentagon officials who had been involved in the contract evaluation process. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial shock, growing concern about TechFlow's decision-making, and questions about the company's financial stability and long-term viability. Word travels fast in government circles, especially when it involves concerns about contractor reliability. By evening, I was receiving calls from Pentagon officials I hadn't spoken to directly, all asking variations of the same question: is TechFlow still a viable partner for this contract? I maintained professional neutrality in every conversation, but the damage was already done. Marcus had created a crisis of confidence at exactly the wrong moment. The Pentagon officials who had been enthusiastic about moving forward were now questioning whether TechFlow was the kind of stable, reliable partner they needed for such a critical project. Marcus had no idea that these conversations were happening. He was probably celebrating his cost-cutting success, confident that the Pentagon contract was a done deal that didn't require my ongoing involvement. He was about to discover that relationships matter more than paperwork, and that trust, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. The network I'd spent years building was awakening to the reality of Marcus's decision, and they didn't like what they were seeing. While I was having difficult conversations with Pentagon officials about TechFlow's sudden instability, Marcus was in his office crafting a press release that would become a monument to his arrogance and complete misunderstanding of the situation he'd created. The draft press release, which I would learn about later from former colleagues, began with the headline, TechFlow Solutions secures historic $67 million Department of Defense contract. The text went on to quote Marcus extensively about the company's strategic vision and innovative approach to cybersecurity challenges. This contract represents validation of TechFlow's position as a leader in government cybersecurity solutions. Marcus was quoted as saying, "Our team's expertise and dedication to excellence has positioned us to protect our nation's most critical digital infrastructure." The press release made no mention of the 7 months of relationship building that had made the contract possible. It contained no reference to the technical innovations that had set our proposal apart from competitors. Instead, it focused on Marcus's leadership and vision, as if the Pentagon had awarded the contract based on his personal charisma rather than months of careful work by people he'd just discarded. But the most telling detail was buried in the final paragraph. TechFlow's streamlined operations and efficient management structure position the company for rapid growth and expansion in the government sector. Marcus was actually using my termination as a selling point, suggesting that eliminating experienced personnel was a sign of good business management rather than catastrophic short-sightedness. He'd also begun reaching out to potential replacements for my position, but with a budget that revealed how little he understood about the role's requirements. The job posting, which he'd already prepared, offered $65,000 annually for a government contract coordinator, with basic understanding of federal procurement processes and strong organizational skills. Marcus genuinely believed that he could replace 7 months of relationship building and 5 years of specialized expertise with someone willing to work for half my salary and follow detailed instructions. He saw government relations as administrative work rather than strategic relationship management. His confidence wasn't entirely unfounded from his limited perspective. The Pentagon hadn't officially withdrawn from negotiations. The procurement timeline was still on track for Friday's final approval. From his office, surrounded by the press releases and congratulatory messages he was preparing, everything looked like it was proceeding according to plan. Marcus had also scheduled a staff meeting for Thursday morning to announce the successful conclusion of the Pentagon contract negotiations. He planned to present the win as vindication of his leadership and evidence that the company was moving in the right direction. The meeting agenda included discussion of expansion opportunities and strategic restructuring for growth. He'd even begun discussing bonus distributions with the finance team, allocating rewards for what he saw as a company-wide success. The sales team would receive substantial bonuses for supporting the government relations effort. Marketing would be rewarded for positioning TechFlow as an industry leader. The technical team would get smaller recognition payments for contributing to proposal development. No bonus was allocated for the person who had actually secured the contract, because that person was no longer employed by the company. Marcus's treatment of my replacement search revealed the depth of his misunderstanding. He'd instructed HR to find someone who could maintain relationships with government contacts and oversee contract implementation. When the HR director pointed out that government relations required specialized knowledge and security clearances, Marcus dismissed these concerns. "Look, the hard work is done," he told the HR team. "The Pentagon wants to work with us. We just need someone organized enough to manage the paperwork and keep the timeline on track. Any competent project manager can handle that." He'd also begun making plans to personally take over the strategic aspects of the Pentagon relationship. Marcus envisioned himself giving presentations to senior Pentagon officials, attending high-level meetings, and positioning himself as the visionary leader behind TechFlow's government success. The irony was that Marcus had no security clearance, no technical understanding of military cybersecurity requirements, and no relationships with any of the Pentagon officials who would be overseeing the contract. He was planning to insert himself into relationships that had taken me years to build, with no understanding of the professional protocols and personal dynamics that made those relationships work. Meanwhile, he was fielding congratulatory calls from investors and board members who had heard rumors about the impending Pentagon announcement. Marcus basked in the praise, accepting credit for strategic decisions he'd never made and technical innovations he didn't understand. "This is exactly the kind of breakthrough we've been working toward," he told one major investor. "It validates our entire approach and positions us for the next phase of growth. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions about personnel to ensure the company can capitalize on opportunities like this." The tough decision about personnel had been made with no consultation, no consideration of consequences, and no understanding that the very opportunity he was celebrating had just been put in mortal jeopardy by his actions. Marcus Webb was about to discover that government contracts aren't just awarded, they're earned, maintained, and delivered through the kind of expertise and relationships he'd just thrown away to save $1,200 per month. The celebration he was planning was about to become a wake for his company's future. Thursday morning arrived with the precision of a military operation, which was fitting since it was the Pentagon that delivered the first official blow to Marcus's fantasy of easy success. The call came at 8:47 a.m., just as Marcus was reviewing his prepared remarks for the staff meeting where he planned to announce TechFlow's triumph. Colonel Martinez's voice was formal and cold when Marcus answered the phone, expecting congratulations and final confirmation of the contract award. "Mr. Webb, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Pentagon's Network Security Operations Division. I'm calling regarding some concerns that have arisen about TechFlow's ability to fulfill the terms of our pending contract." Marcus's confusion was evident in his response. According to Jennifer, his assistant, who could hear both sides of the conversation from her desk outside his office, "Colonel Martinez, I'm not sure I understand. Is there a problem with our technical proposal? I thought everything was approved and ready for final signature." "Mr. Webb, our primary concern is about personnel continuity and your company's commitment to the relationship management aspects of this contract. We've learned that Anna Sanders is no longer with your organization. Ms. Sanders has been our primary point of contact throughout this process, and her departure raises questions about your company's stability and long-term viability." The silence from Marcus's office stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When he finally responded, his voice had the strained quality of someone trying to maintain composure while realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. "Colonel, I can assure you that Ms. Sanders' departure won't affect our ability to deliver on this contract. We have other qualified personnel who can handle the implementation requirements." "Mr. Webb, with respect, Ms. Sanders wasn't just handling implementation requirements. She was our trusted partner in developing the technical specifications that made your proposal viable. She understood our operational needs, our security concerns, and our long-term strategic objectives. Her departure suggests either that TechFlow doesn't value the relationships that made this contract possible, or that your company is facing financial pressures that forced you to eliminate key personnel. Marcus tried to recover with the kind of corporate speak that worked in investor meetings, that sounded hollow when addressing military professionals, who valued directness and competence above all else. Colonel Martinez, I understand your concerns, but this personnel change is actually part of our strategic restructuring to better serve government clients. We're bringing in new talent and expanding our capabilities. Mr. Webb, I'm going to be very direct with you. The Department of Defense doesn't award $67 million contracts to companies that treat their key personnel as disposable. We need partners who understand that relationships matter, that expertise has value, and that trust isn't transferable from one person to another just because it's convenient for your budget. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Marcus becoming increasingly desperate as he realized that his assumption about government contracts being automatic was completely wrong. Colonel Martinez wasn't calling to congratulate him. She was calling to express formal concerns that could torpedo the entire deal. Mr. Webb, the Pentagon will be conducting an additional review of TechFlow's organizational stability and long-term viability before proceeding with final contract approval. This review will include evaluation of your personnel decisions, financial position, and commitment to maintaining the relationships that supported your proposal. After Colonel Martinez hung up, Marcus sat in stunned silence for several minutes, before calling an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The triumphant announcement he'd planned was replaced by a crisis management session focused on damage control, but the Pentagon's call was just the beginning. By noon, Marcus was dealing with inquiries from 3 different government agencies that had heard about my departure and were questioning TechFlow's reliability for their own pending contracts. The Small Business Administration called to express concerns about a $2.3 million cybersecurity consulting contract that was in final negotiations. The Department of Homeland Security requested clarification about personnel changes affecting a border security technology project. The Department of Energy wanted assurance that TechFlow could maintain continuity for a critical infrastructure protection initiative. Each call followed the same pattern. Government officials who had been working with me personally were now questioning whether TechFlow was the kind of stable, reliable partner they needed for sensitive national security projects. Marcus's response to each inquiry became increasingly frantic as he realized that my departure hadn't just affected one contract, it had created a crisis of confidence that threatened every government relationship the company had built. I don't understand what's happening, he told David Chun during their emergency meeting. One personnel change shouldn't cause this kind of reaction. These contracts were based on our technical capabilities, not on one employee. David, who had always been more aware of the relationship aspects of government work, tried to explain what should have been obvious. Marcus, Anna wasn't just an employee, she was the face of our company to every government client we have. These officials don't know TechFlow as a brand. They know Anna as a person they trust. When she leaves suddenly, it signals that something is seriously wrong with our organization. By the end of Thursday, Marcus had received formal notification that the Pentagon was postponing final approval of the $67 million contract pending additional organizational review. The other government contracts were similarly placed on hold. While agencies conducted their own assessments of TechFlow's stability, the company that had been 3 days away from its biggest success was now facing the possibility of losing not just the Pentagon deal, but every government contract that represented the foundation of its revenue. Marcus Webb was beginning to learn the most expensive lesson of his career, that saving $1,200 per month by eliminating the wrong person could cost everything he'd worked to build. The Pentagon's organizational review began on Friday morning with a thoroughness that revealed just how seriously Colonel Martinez and her team took contractor reliability. What Marcus had dismissed as routine bureaucracy was actually a comprehensive audit designed to uncover any factors that might compromise a contractor's ability to deliver on critical national security projects. The review team, led by Captain Maria Santos, requested detailed financial statements, organizational charts, personnel records, and documentation of all key relationships related to the cybersecurity contract. They also initiated direct interviews with Pentagon officials who had interacted with TechFlow. Throughout the proposal process, what they discovered painted a picture of a company that was far less stable and far more dependent on a single individual than Marcus had ever admitted. Even to himself, the financial analysis revealed that TechFlow was operating with less than 4 months of cash reserves and had been consistently losing money for the past 18 months. The company's debt-to-equity ratio was at dangerous levels, and several vendor payments were overdue. Most damning, the timing of my termination, 3 days before final contract approval, suggested that financial desperation had driven the decision rather than strategic planning. But the most devastating revelations came from the technical review. When Pentagon engineers attempted to discuss implementation details with TechFlow's remaining staff, they discovered that no one else at the company fully understood the quantum-resistant encryption approach that had been central to our winning proposal. The encryption methodology wasn't just a technical specification. It was a custom solution I developed specifically to address future cybersecurity threats that Colonel Martinez had identified based on her operational experience. The solution required deep understanding of both current military protocols and emerging quantum computing capabilities. Marcus had assigned Tom Richardson, a junior technical analyst, to serve as my replacement for Pentagon communications. Tom was competent within his area of expertise, but when Pentagon engineers asked him to explain the quantum-resistant implementation timeline, he had to admit that he'd never seen the detailed technical documentation. "I'm not sure I understand the specific encryption approach Anna developed," Tom told Captain Santos during their review call. "I know it was something innovative that impressed your technical team, but I don't have access to her research files or implementation notes." Captain Santos's response was swift and pointed. "Mr. Richardson, you're telling me that TechFlow submitted a proposal based on technical innovations that only one person understood, and that person is no longer with your company? How exactly do you plan to implement a solution that your current staff can't explain?" The situation became worse when the Pentagon team discovered that the custom encryption solution wasn't just complex. It was specifically designed around relationships and information that I developed through years of interaction with military cybersecurity professionals. The quantum-resistant approach had emerged from conversations with my brother about Army cybersecurity protocols, discussions with Air Force technical specialists at industry conferences, and insights from Navy cryptography experts who'd shared concerns about emerging threats. These weren't formal consultations that could be documented and transferred. They were professional relationships built on trust and mutual respect. Moreover, the Pentagon's review revealed that several critical aspects of our proposal had been based on informal commitments and understandings that existed only in my relationships with key officials. Colonel Martinez had agreed to expedited security clearance processes for our technical staff based on her confidence in my judgment. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had committed to providing access to classified threat assessments based on my demonstrated reliability over multiple projects. These commitments weren't documented in formal contracts. They were professional courtesies, extended to someone who had earned trust through years of competent, ethical work. With my departure, the Pentagon officials were no longer willing to extend these accommodations to a company that had demonstrated such poor judgment in personnel decisions. The review also uncovered something that Marcus had never bothered to investigate: the extent to which other government contracts depended on relationships I'd built and maintained. The Small Business Administration contract included implementation requirements that I'd negotiated based on personal knowledge of their technical infrastructure. The Department of Homeland Security project relied on security protocols I'd developed through years of collaboration with their cybersecurity team. Captain Santos's final report was devastating in its clinical assessment of TechFlow's capabilities. Without my involvement, the contractor's proposal was built around technical innovations and Relationship commitments that appear to have been concentrated in a single individual who is no longer with the organization. Current staff cannot adequately explain key technical approaches, and the contractor has lost access to the informal cooperation and expedited processes that made their implementation timeline viable. The Pentagon cannot proceed with confidence that TechFlow can deliver the proposed solution within the specified timeframe and quality standards. When Marcus received a copy of this report on Friday afternoon, he finally began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The Pentagon wasn't just questioning TechFlow's stability. They were documenting that the company couldn't actually deliver what it had promised. But the most painful revelation was yet to come. As Marcus frantically tried to understand what had gone wrong, he discovered that I had tried to warn him about these exact issues months earlier. Buried in his email archives were 3 separate messages I'd sent over the past 6 months, each one explaining the personal nature of government relationships, the importance of continuity in key personnel, and the risks associated with rapid staff changes. During critical contract periods, Marcus had never responded to any of these emails. He dismissed them as an employee, trying to make herself indispensable rather than genuine warnings about business risks. Now those warnings read like a prophecy of the disaster he'd created through his own arrogance and SIGHTEDNESS. Morning brought the news that Marcus had been dreading, but couldn't bring himself to believe would actually happen. The call came from Captain Santos at 9:15 a.m., delivered with the professional courtesy that military officers reserve for the most serious communications. Mr. Webb, after completing our organizational review, the Department of Defense has decided to terminate contract negotiations with TechFlow Solutions, effective immediately. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He actually staggered backward from his desk, reaching for his chair to steady himself as the full implications crashed over him. Captain Santos, surely there must be some way to address your concerns. Willing to bring in additional personnel, provide whatever assurances you need about our capabilities. Mr. Webb, the decision is final. Our review determined that TechFlow cannot deliver the technical solution proposed without the expertise that is no longer available within your organization. Additionally, your company's financial instability and decision to eliminate key personnel 3 days before contract finalization demonstrates a level of poor judgment that makes you unsuitable as a defense contractor. But Captain Santos wasn't finished. The Pentagon's termination letter, which arrived by email minutes after the phone call, contained language that would haunt Marcus far beyond this single contract. TechFlow Solutions has been flagged in the Pentagon's contractor database as organizationally unreliable pending further review. This designation will affect the company's eligibility for future Department of Defense contracts and may be shared with other federal agencies conducting contractor evaluations. The organizationally unreliable designation was a death sentence for any company hoping to work with the federal government. It meant that TechFlow would face additional scrutiny, extended review periods, and skepticism from procurement officers across all government agencies. Within hours of the Pentagon's announcement, the ripple effects began cascading through every aspect of TechFlow's business. The Small Business Administration formally withdrew their $2.3 million consulting contract, citing concerns about contractor stability. The Department of Homeland Security suspended negotiations on the border security project. The Department of Energy requested a complete re-evaluation of TechFlow's qualifications for critical infrastructure work, but the damage extended beyond government contracts. Private sector clients who had been attracted by TechFlow's government credentials began questioning whether the company was a reliable partner. 2 major corporate clients requested meetings to discuss the stability of our ongoing relationship. Marcus spent the day in a series of increasingly desperate phone calls, trying to convince government officials that the Pentagon's concerns were overblown, that TechFlow remained fully capable of delivering on its commitments. Each conversation followed the same pattern: polite but firm statements that decisions had been made, and would not be reconsidered. The company's board of directors called an emergency meeting for Tuesday morning. Marcus knew that his job was on the line, but more immediately, the company's survival was in question. Without the Pentagon contract and with other government relationships in jeopardy, TechFlow's revenue projections had essentially collapsed overnight. By Tuesday afternoon, the full scope of the catastrophe was becoming clear. The company's stock price, already depressed by months of poor financial performance, plummeted by 67% as news of the Pentagon's decision spread through industry networks. Investor confidence evaporated as it became apparent that Marcus had destroyed the very relationships that made TechFlow valuable. The local business journal published a devastating article titled "Tech Startup $67 Million Mistake," detailing how a personnel decision made to save $1,200 monthly had cost the company its largest contract and damaged its reputation throughout the government sector. Industry analysts were brutal in their assessment. "This is a case study in how not to manage client relationships," one expert told the journal. "Government contracts are built on personal trust and institutional memory. You can't just fire the person who embodies those relationships and expect the contracts to remain intact." Marcus's arrogance had become a public humiliation, but more than that, it had become a cautionary tale that would follow him for the rest of his career. The investor lawsuit arrived on Wednesday, filed by Meridian Capital Partners on behalf of all TechFlow shareholders. The legal document was a masterpiece of corporate fury, methodically documenting how Marcus's reckless and negligent decision-making had destroyed shareholder value and violated his fiduciary duties as CEO. The lawsuit's most damaging allegations centered on Marcus's failure to understand the value of key personnel and his misrepresentation of the company's stability to investors. The legal team had clearly done their homework, uncovering emails where Marcus had assured investors that government contracts were secure and guaranteed, even while planning to eliminate the person who had secured them. Defendant Webb demonstrated gross negligence in terminating the employee most responsible for the company's government relationships, the lawsuit stated. This decision was made without consultation, without consideration of consequences, and in direct contradiction to reasonable business judgment. But the lawsuit was just the beginning of TechFlow's legal troubles. Within days, vendor lawsuits began piling up as suppliers who had been waiting for payment realized that the Pentagon contract would no longer provide the cash flow they'd been promised. The company's equipment leasing company filed for immediate repossession of servers and networking hardware. The office landlord demanded 3 months of rent in advance to prevent eviction proceedings. More devastating than the external lawsuits were the internal consequences. By Thursday, 12 employees had submitted resignation letters, including most of the technical team that represented TechFlow's core competency. These weren't just departures, they were an exodus of talent fleeing a sinking ship. The resignations created a vicious cycle that accelerated the company's collapse. As word spread that key technical staff were leaving, the few remaining private sector clients began terminating their contracts. Partners who had been considering joint ventures suddenly became unavailable for meetings. The company's reputation within the cybersecurity industry was collapsing as rapidly as its financial position. Marcus's attempts at damage control only made things worse. He scheduled an all-hands meeting to address employee concerns, but his presentation revealed how completely he still misunderstood the situation he'd created. "We're facing some temporary challenges due to unfair government bureaucracy," he told the remaining staff. "The Pentagon's decision was based on politics rather than merit, and we're exploring legal options to challenge their discriminatory treatment." The response from employees was immediate and devastating. Sarah Chen, the lead network engineer, stood up during the Q&A session and delivered a response that would be remembered long after TechFlow ceased to exist. "Marcus, the Pentagon's decision wasn't political, it was logical. Anna was the most knowledgeable, most connected, most valuable person in this company, and you fired her to save the cost of a nice dinner. You didn't just lose a contract, you proved that you don't understand what makes this company valuable. The meeting ended with Marcus storming out and Sarah leading most of the technical team in submitting immediate resignations. Meanwhile, I was watching TechFlow's destruction from my new position at CyberGuard Solutions, a larger cybersecurity firm that had hired me within a week of my termination. The irony wasn't lost on me. CyberGuard had been one of TechFlow's main competitors for the Pentagon contract, and they'd immediately recognized the value that Marcus had thrown away. My new role came with a 40% salary increase, equity participation, and immediate respect for my expertise. More importantly, CyberGuard understood that government relationships were assets to be nurtured, rather than expenses to be eliminated. Within my first month at CyberGuard, I'd helped them secure 2 government contracts worth a combined $23 million. The Pentagon officials who had lost confidence in TechFlow were eager to work with a company that valued the relationships and expertise they considered essential. Colonel Martinez called me personally to express relief that I'd found a more suitable professional environment. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison recommended CyberGuard for a Navy cybersecurity project specifically because of my involvement. The network of relationships that Marcus had dismissed as unnecessary overhead became the foundation for my new companies. Rapid growth in the government sector. The contrast couldn't have been starker. While TechFlow collapsed under the weight of Marcus's poor decisions, CyberGuard thrived by recognizing and leveraging the expertise he discarded. The cybersecurity industry is smaller than most people realize, and news travels fast when a major contract is lost due to management incompetence. Within 2 weeks of the Pentagon's decision, my story had become legend in government contracting circles, not as a cautionary tale about employee loyalty, but as an example of how spectacular success can emerge from devastating betrayal. Cybersecurity, today the industry's most respected publication, contacted me for an interview about relationship management in government contracting. The resulting article, titled "The Personal Side of Defense Contracts," became one of their most read pieces of the year. Government officials aren't buying technology, I explained to the journalist. They're investing in relationships with people they trust to protect national security. Companies that don't understand this fundamental reality will always struggle to compete effectively in the federal marketplace. The article detailed my background, my approach to building Pentagon relationships, and the technical innovations that had made TechFlow's proposal competitive. But it also mentioned Marcus's decision to terminate me 3 days before contract finalization, without naming him directly. When leadership fails to recognize the value of established relationships, the article quoted me as saying, "They often discover that those relationships aren't transferable assets. They're personal bonds built on trust and mutual respect." The response from industry peers was overwhelming. Within days of the article's publication, I received job offers from 6 major cybersecurity firms, invitations to speak at 3 industry conferences, and requests for consulting from companies struggling with their own government relationship challenges. But the most satisfying recognition came from the people who mattered most, the government officials I'd worked with over the years. Colonel Martinez wrote a LinkedIn recommendation that became a masterclass in professional endorsement. Anna Sanders represents the gold standard for government contractor relationships. Her technical expertise is matched only by her integrity and genuine commitment to national security. Any organization fortunate enough to work with Anna will find her to be not just a contractor, but a trusted partner in protecting our nation's critical infrastructure. The recommendation was shared hundreds of times and commented on by dozens of Pentagon officials, creating a public record of my value that no amount of corporate restructuring could diminish. My speaking engagement at the National Cybersecurity Conference became a standing room-only session. My presentation, "Building Trust in High-Stakes Environments," drew from lessons learned through both success and betrayal. Trust isn't built through contracts or proposals, I told the audience. Of 400 cybersecurity professionals, it's built through consistent competence, reliable communication, and genuine respect for the mission you're supporting. When leadership treats trust building as overhead rather than investment, they're essentially gambling their company's future on the assumption that relationships don't matter. The audience included several former TechFlow employees who had since found positions with other firms. During the Q&A session, one of them asked about my emotional response to Marcus's decision. "Betrayal hurts," I answered honestly. "But it also clarifies. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them." My experience taught me to value organizations that recognize expertise rather than merely tolerate it. The cybersecurity community's response to my story created opportunities I'd never imagined. CyberGuard promoted me to Director of Government Relations within 3 months, recognizing that my reputation and relationships were strategic assets worth building around. More importantly, other women in the industry began reaching out to share their own stories of being undervalued or overlooked. The response made me realize that my experience, while painful, had revealed something important about how talent is recognized and rewarded in our industry. I'd become inadvertently influential in conversations about workplace respect, professional value, and the importance of leaders who understand what makes their organization successful. In the quiet moments between CyberGuard meetings and Pentagon conference calls, I found myself processing the emotional journey that had brought me from devastating betrayal to unexpected triumph. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It required confronting feelings I'd never expected to experience in my professional life. I started keeping a personal journal, not for any strategic purpose, but because I needed to understand what had happened to me and how it had changed my perspective on work, loyalty, and self-worth. The journal became a space where I could be honest about the pain Marcus's betrayal had caused, and the growth that had emerged from that pain. "Trust is fragile," I wrote in one early entry. I spent 5 years believing that competence and loyalty would eventually be recognized and rewarded. Marcus's decision taught me that some people are incapable of recognizing value, and that my worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. The writing process helped me understand that my experience with TechFlow hadn't just been about losing a job, it had been about discovering my own professional identity independent of any single employer's recognition. Working at CyberGuard provided daily evidence of what healthy workplace relationships looked like. My new colleagues sought my input on strategic decisions, respected my expertise, and treated me as a valuable team member rather than expensive overhead. The contrast with Marcus's management style was stark and illuminating. Dr. Rachel Morrison, CyberGuard's CEO, became an unexpected mentor in understanding leadership that values talent rather than merely exploiting it. During one of our monthly check-ins, she offered insight that reframed my entire TechFlow experience. "Anna, what happened to you wasn't a reflection of your value, it was a reflection of Marcus's inability to recognize value. Great leaders understand that their job is to amplify the talents of their team members, not to take credit for results they didn't create." Dr. Morrison's leadership style was the opposite of Marcus's in every meaningful way. She asked questions rather than making assumptions. She credited team members publicly for their contributions. She invested in people's professional development rather than treating them as replaceable resources. "Leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room," she told me during one conversation about my career goals. "It's about creating an environment where the smartest people want to do their best work." Marcus failed because he never understood that distinction. My journal entries began reflecting a growing sense of personal empowerment that had nothing to do with revenge against Marcus, and everything to do with understanding my own professional worth. I spent years seeking validation from someone who was fundamentally incapable of providing it, I wrote. My expertise, my relationships, my contributions, they were always valuable. Marcus's inability to recognize that value says nothing about me and everything about his limitations as a leader. The healing process also involved reconnecting with aspects of my personality that had been suppressed during my years at TechFlow. I'd become so focused on proving my worth to Marcus that I'd lost touch with the confidence and assertiveness that had made me successful in the first place. At CyberGuard, I found myself speaking up more in meetings, offering strategic suggestions beyond my immediate responsibilities, and taking on leadership roles that matched my expertise and experience. The company's culture encouraged this kind of engagement rather than punishing it. Most importantly, I began to understand that loyalty is a two-way relationship that requires mutual respect and recognition to be sustainable. 6 months after Marcus's catastrophic decision, I signed my name to a new employment contract that represented everything TechFlow could have been if it had been led by someone who understood the value of talent. The document itself was symbolic not just of my new role at CyberGuard, but of my evolution from an undervalued employee to a recognized industry leader. The contract offered a base salary of $168,000, nearly 40% more than Marcus had been paying, plus equity participation that could double my compensation as the company grew. But more meaningful than the financial terms were the clauses that demonstrated genuine respect for my expertise and contributions. I was designated as Senior Director of Government Relations and Strategic Partnerships, with explicit authority over all federal contract negotiations and direct reporting to CEO Dr. Morrison. The contract included provisions for continuing education, conference attendance, and professional development that treated my expertise as an investment worthy of ongoing cultivation. Most importantly, the contract included a key personnel clause that prevented my termination without board approval, recognizing that my relationships and expertise were strategic assets that couldn't be casually discarded for short-term financial considerations. My integration into CyberGuard's leadership team was seamless in ways that revealed how dysfunctional TechFlow's culture had actually been. Instead of working in isolation and fighting for recognition, I found myself collaborating with colleagues who understood that my success contributed to everyone's success. Within my first 3 months, I'd helped CyberGuard secure 2 major government contracts worth a combined $31 million. The Pentagon's Eastern Command project, originally destined for TechFlow, was reopened for bidding, and CyberGuard's proposal, built around my relationships and technical understanding, won the contract with minor modifications. Colonel Martinez's enthusiasm about working with CyberGuard was evident in every interaction. "Anna, it's such a relief to be working with an organization that values the people who make things happen," she told me during our first implementation meeting. "Your new company clearly understands what TechFlow never figured out. That my success at CyberGuard extended beyond simply recreating what I'd built at TechFlow." Dr. Morrison encouraged me to think strategically about expanding our government relationships into new agencies and new types of contracts. I proposed and launched CyberGuard's Next-Gen Defense Initiative, a program focused on quantum-resistant cybersecurity solutions for military applications. The initiative combined my technical expertise with my government relationships to position CyberGuard as the leading provider of future-focused defense technology. The program's success led to my appointment as CyberGuard's first vice president of federal strategic development, a role created specifically to leverage my expertise and relationships. The promotion came with additional equity, participation, and a seat on the company's executive committee. My new platform also created opportunities to mentor other professionals navigating government contracting careers. I began hosting monthly GovCon coffee sessions where cybersecurity professionals could discuss relationship-building strategies, career development, and the unique challenges of working with federal agencies. These mentoring relationships reminded me daily of how much my perspective had changed since leaving TechFlow. Instead of seeking validation from leaders who couldn't provide it, I was creating value for people who appreciated expertise and invested in talent development. The contrast with Marcus's leadership couldn't have been starker. While he had viewed me as expensive overhead, CyberGuard's leadership team treated me as a strategic asset whose success drove the entire organization's growth in the government sector. The bankruptcy filing arrived in my email as a news alert, not because I was actively following TechFlow's demise, but because industry publications were tracking the company's collapse as a case study in corporate mismanagement. TechFlow Solutions files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Read the headline, followed by a brief summary that captured the complete destruction of what had once been a promising cybersecurity firm. The filing documents, which became public record, told the story of a company that had lost everything Marcus thought he was protecting when he fired me. Total assets, $1.2 million. Total liabilities, $8.7 million. The $67 million Pentagon contract was listed under lost business opportunities, with a note that its termination had materially contributed to the company's financial collapse. Marcus's personal financial situation was equally devastating. The bankruptcy included his personal guarantees on company loans, his home mortgage, and even his Tesla lease. The man who had fired me to save $1,200 per month had lost everything in the process, but I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. The emotion that surprised me was sadness, not for Marcus, who had created his own destruction through arrogance and poor judgment, but for the talented people who had suffered because of his decisions. 23 employees lost their jobs. When TechFlow closed, most found new positions within the cybersecurity industry, and I was able to help several of them land roles at CyberGuard and other firms. Sarah Chen, the network engineer who had confronted Marcus during his final staff meeting, joined my team as a senior technical analyst. "Anna, working with you again feels like coming home," Sarah told me during her first week at CyberGuard. Marcus never understood that the technical team and government relations were supposed to work together, not compete for resources. Bankruptcy proceedings revealed details about Marcus's decision-making that were even more damaging than I'd realized. Court documents showed that he had planned my termination for weeks before the Pentagon contract was finalized, viewing my $120,000 salary as unnecessary overhead once government relationships were established. His fundamental misunderstanding of how government contracting actually worked was documented in emails to investors, where he claimed that federal contracts are self-sustaining once awarded, and that relationship management is primarily a sales function that can be outsourced or eliminated. The court-appointed trustee's report was scathing in its assessment of Marcus's leadership. The debtor's management demonstrated a pattern of decisions that prioritized short-term cost reduction over long-term relationship preservation, ultimately destroying the very assets that made the company valuable to its government clients. Reading those documents, I realized that Marcus had never understood what made TechFlow successful. He saw government contracts as products to be sold, rather than relationships to be maintained. He viewed expertise as a cost center rather than a revenue generator. Most fundamentally, he treated people as interchangeable resources rather than unique assets with specific, irreplaceable value. The industry's response to TechFlow's bankruptcy was swift and unforgiving. Marcus Webb became a cautionary tale discussed in business schools and management conferences as an example of how not to manage talent and client relationships. My feelings about his downfall were complicated but ultimately clear. I took no pleasure in his suffering, but I felt validated that the market had recognized what he never could: that expertise, relationships, and trust have real economic value that can't be easily replaced or transferred. The invitation to speak at the National Business Ethics Conference arrived exactly 1 year after Marcus had fired me to save $1,200 per month. The conference organizers wanted me to address talent recognition and retention in high-stakes industries, using my experience as a case study in how organizations succeed or fail based on their treatment of key personnel. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of 500 business leaders, I felt the full weight of my transformation from victim to advocate. My presentation wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about sharing lessons that could help other professionals recognize their worth and help leaders understand the true cost of poor personnel decisions. Talent isn't just about individual capability, I told the audience. It's about relationships, institutional knowledge, and the trust that takes years to build but can be destroyed in a single careless decision. When leaders treat expertise as overhead rather than investment, they're gambling their organization's future on the assumption that relationships don't matter. The response was immediate and powerful. During the Q&A session, executives shared their own stories of valuable employees who had left due to poor management decisions, and the long-term consequences those departures had created. One CEO from an aerospace company stood up to share how losing a key engineer to a competitor had cost them a $200 million NASA contract. "We thought we could replace 20 years of experience with 2 entry-level engineers and save money," he said. "Instead, we lost our most important client relationship and spent 3 years trying to rebuild credibility." Another executive described how her company had learned to identify and protect relationship assets, employees whose departure would create immediate business risks. "We realized that some people aren't just employees," she explained. "They're the human embodiment of our company's reputation and capabilities." My presentation included specific recommendations for both employees and leaders based on lessons learned from my TechFlow experience. For professionals, document your contributions, build relationships beyond your immediate employer, and never mistake loyalty for obligation to accept poor treatment. Your expertise has value that exists independent of any single organization's recognition. For leaders, understand that some employees represent strategic assets whose value far exceeds their salary costs. Before making personnel decisions, consider the full economic impact of losing institutional knowledge, client relationships, and specialized expertise. The most meaningful part of the presentation was sharing how my experience had led to personal growth that extended far beyond professional success. Betrayal taught me to trust my own assessment of my worth, rather than seeking validation from people incapable of providing it. I told the audience, after the presentation, I was approached by dozens of professionals sharing their own stories of workplace betrayal, undervaluation, and eventual triumph. Many were women in technical fields who had experienced similar patterns of having their contributions overlooked or minimized. These conversations led to the most important realization of my journey. My experience wasn't unique, and my story could help others navigate similar challenges with greater confidence and self-advocacy. Years after Marcus Webb's decision to save $1,200 per month cost him a $67 million contract and ultimately his entire company, I stood in CyberGuard's new training facility, watching 12 women cybersecurity professionals participate in the first session of the Next Gen Leadership Initiative, a mentorship program I'd created to help others avoid the pitfalls I'd experienced and accelerate their career growth. Program charter reflected everything I'd learned about the importance of recognizing and developing talent rather than simply expecting it to flourish without support. Each participant would receive technical training, relationship building guidance, and most importantly, coaching on self-advocacy and professional worth recognition. Your expertise has value that exists independent of any single employer's ability to recognize it, I told the first cohort during our opening session. My experience taught me that loyalty should be earned through mutual respect, not given freely to those who take it for granted. The mentorship program was funded through CyberGuard's strategic development budget, demonstrating the company's understanding that investing in talent development creates long-term competitive advantages. Dr. Morrison had embraced the initiative enthusiastically, recognizing that developing industry leaders strengthened the entire cybersecurity ecosystem. Reflecting on my journey from devastating betrayal to industry leadership, I realized that Marcus's cruel decision had inadvertently created the catalyst for my greatest professional success. His inability to recognize my value had forced me to recognize it myself, leading to opportunities I never would have pursued while seeking his validation. The irony was complete. Marcus had fired me to cut costs and had lost everything in the process, while I had gained not just financial success, but genuine professional fulfillment working with leaders who understood the strategic value of expertise and relationships. CyberGuard's government contracts division, which I now led, had grown to represent 60% of the company's revenue. We'd secured contracts with every major federal agency, established partnerships with military cybersecurity units worldwide, and positioned ourselves as the industry leader in quantum-resistant defense technology. But beyond professional success, my experience had taught me lessons about resilience, self-worth, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who recognize and nurture talent rather than exploit it. Standing before those 12 women, I shared the most important truth I'd learned. You don't need anyone's permission to know your worth. Document your contributions, build relationships beyond any single organization, and never accept treatment that doesn't match your value. Sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing the scales. If you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or betrayed by someone who should have protected your interests, remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Trust your expertise, build your network, and never be afraid to find organizations that appreciate what you bring to the table. Marcus Webb learned the hard way that talented people aren't overhead to be eliminated, they're assets to be treasured. His $67 million lesson became my foundation for helping others recognize their worth and demand the respect they deserve.